This slide I put in because it actually suggests that some of the things that people are supposing we do about creating a view of climate and how we go forward are not independent from a whole pile of other things that we want to do. And that even if you are not certain about this and you have assessed the risk as being low perhaps, that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't actually act, because there's a whole pile of other things that you can actually gain in doing that. So lessons from sustainability. Well, the word sustainability has been used a lot, sort of replacing the word environment in many ways. And it's sort of about a sustainable planet, a just society, a growing economy. We still think we need more. And so we have to have that growing as well. And it's not really about me or anyone else actually having a vision about what that looks like. It's really about setting in place a process, a dynamic process, where we move from where we are to a state that's more likely to be sustainable in a whole series of different ways. And those different ways are the way the economy, the society and the natural environment actually work together. But it can be scary thinking about that, partly because it requires strategic thinking, and this is in short supply. Again, I'll come back to that. But it's also because it's complex. It's uncertain. We really don't know what the best way to live is, or what our aspirations might be best for our children and grandchildren. But most of all, it's because it challenges the way we are, what we really expect at the moment in our worldview, our infrastructure is established to deliver to us at the moment, and the way our investments are made. But the other way of looking at this is the positive way, and that is that any change can be an opportunity to build win-win outcomes. Win-win are not always possible because of the sectoralisation of the way our society works, and that individual companies, individual sectors of the society are often actually in competition. Going to any government in Australia, state or federal, and talk to individuals within a department and find out how competitive those departments are. That doesn't really help in getting win-win situations. But we really do, I think all of us want to contribute to a world that we wish to leave for our children and grandchildren. So in going through this, this is the way after 41 years I think about climate change. I spent most of my working career here, building climate models, understanding the global carbon cycle, and managing people who actually looked at the consequences of a changing climate globally and nationally. And then about 10 years ago, thinking, well, of course, all of this has been driven by the energy cycle, not all of it actually, but nearly all of it. And that really relates to the choice of technology where we have made and the efficiency with which we can do things. And that all comes back to energy demand, and that all comes back to how many there are of us and the affluence, what we expect to have, how much energy do we want in order to be happy to achieve the goals that we want in the future. So all of these things are connected, so it's really interesting that I think that I'll be followed by a talk on energy, because it underpins this. The things are very closely related. But underpinning all of these also are issues about us, and the most important one are, our perceptions, often not actually even conscious about what well-being and success really is. The city is full of people who are actually out there making a success of their life that actually influences this, and in many cases haven't really thought about that. So some of the characteristics of a sustainable future are the following, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. And I pinned this one up first because it struck me in managing, at one stage I managed 1,100 scientists in CSIRO. and it was surprised to find that actually a very low percentage of them were strategic in their thinking. And at the time, it really was a big surprise. I thought you'd have to be strategic to be a good scientist. Turns out you don't have to be, actually. But the suggestion to me is that actually within the community, very few people are actually all that strategic. Where most of the time we're actually looking at the extrapolation from where we are to the next step. Without strategic, to me, is casting ourselves out to some distance and thinking about the system and how it might better be, and then coming back and deciding on policies as to how to get there. The important thing is not to be stuck with the notion that the way it has been is the way of the future. We'll be proved wrong anyhow if you do that. But in fact, trying to set goals that are sustainable, we won't do that if we actually don't cast our mind forward. The second issue is leadership, and I'll talk a little bit about the European situation again in a moment, because in the case of climate change, if there's been any leadership, it has actually come out of Europe with regards to the climate change issue. But there are a whole series of issues around leadership. We don't look around the government situation in Australia. There are very few leaders popping up their heads in terms of the sustainability of Australia. And that applies also in the private sector. But if there are leaders, actually the ones that I'm aware of are in the private sector. Now, I don't have time, but there are some very good examples. Flexibility, accepting that uncertainty. We don't know exactly how the climate's going to change anymore, and in fact even more so, we don't know how the existing ecosystems will respond to small, even but quite complex changes in the climate mix and the sulphur issues and the whole part of other things, interventions through farming and so on. We don't know how they're responding. They are responding now. And there's some indications through genetic studies and so on that underneath all of these things happening, changes are taking place. It's not just when species fall off the end and go extinct that we realise these changes are taking place. So flexibility needs to accept that uncertainty is a normal state and just simply has to be managed. You manage it by trying to increase your knowledge, but also being diverse in the kinds of policy views that you have, keeping options open and being nimble to respond when things don't turn out exactly as you thought. The use of markets is important, but also accepting the externalities exist where market approaches may not always be appropriate. And this one comes back to this whole issue of us at the centre of this. Reflection. Considering our expectations, our culture, our history, our education, and a whole pile of other things are really influencing what we perceive to be what we want to do and the way we want the world to be. And bring those things to the surface. Because as I'll show you in a moment, many of them are subconscious. They are things that we've been brought up with in our cultures, from our parents and so on. We think that's the way the world is. And you need to be questioning some of these things. And finally, holism. Solutions mostly don't come out of individual disciplines. Very rarely. So you can actually, in the energy side, you can decide that technically we can capture carbon out of coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley, put it down a hole, and yes, can we do it economically? And yes, does it actually impact on the societies that live in the Latrobe Valley or the other occupations down there? There's a whole pile of more holistic considerations to be considered around this. Now, with regard to the climate issue, this is the indication of how important immediate action really is. This indicates the European Union set a target that the world's temperature should not increase beyond 1990 temperatures by more than 2 degrees. And I can tell you the science underneath that's fairly uncertain, and that's why in these curves I've got a range. But that's accepted in many jurisdictions now as being the target. If we go beyond that globally, 2 degrees, it's dangerous because we're not quite sure of the whole part of consequences, whether they lead to the cryosphere, whether they lead to natural ecosystems, water supply, and all that. And this simply says that if we actually set that we will peak our emissions globally by 2015, I drew this, I think, 2 years ago, and that seemed further away than it is now. It's getting pretty close. Out of this paper in Nature that was in 2009, that we could actually peak our concentration, our temperature at the 2 degrees, and then it would slowly cool down back to natural levels. And therefore, doing that, peaking our emissions globally by 2015 really is the kind of goal for the global community. Now, given that the Chinese and many developing countries are rapidly expanding their use of energy in order to reach the kind of standards of living that we have, this places enormous pressure on countries like Australia and many European countries to reduce their emissions faster than this. And in most cases, we have no evidence that that's really happening. But it also tells you, because of the uncertainty of the science, that even if we achieve that, we've got about a 50% chance that we'll miss the target. We should have done this 20 years ago. This is late in order to be able to get this under control as a global community. And we again don't have a lot of evidence that the seriousness and urgency of that message is getting through. How do we know that? Well, look at fossil fuel emissions over time. This is the black dots. This is the global financial crisis. Yes, the world slowed down, and immediately the next year it went back up on track. Emissions globally are simply going up. There's no indication that global emissions are plateauing, let alone coming down. So that's the position we're actually in. Now, leadership, I mentioned earlier, I think has come to some extent through the EU, and I think, to be fair, the UK has had quite a big impact on that. But they set a carbon trading scheme that you'll recall we've had a lot of argument about in this country. It started operating in 2005. And they, in order to do that, they had to satisfy the fact that they were a union of countries that had very, very different stages of development, very different energy resource availability, and so on. And they did it. And probably not without a lot of argument. I was not in this discussion. But for example, they did it by taking, if you go to the UK, they were accepting in this a reduction of emissions of 12% of 1990 levels for this by the time 2008-2012, which is by now. And Germany, even greater, partly because in the unification of Germany they had lots of opportunities to actually revise the efficiency of systems in the old Eastern Germany. But they accepted that countries like Greece and Luxembourg, Portugal, would grow their emissions. And we've argued about having a national target of any kind, and in fact it's a pretty weak target, but we've now got agreement between the government and coalition of 5% reduction. Whereas the European Union have what they call a 2020 vision, which is a 20% reduction of total emissions by 2020, 20% improvement of energy efficiency, and 20% improvement of renewables, use of renewables. So that I think was a step forward, but in this country we've never had the debate that the availability of resources, energy resources, and demand for energy resources in the state of Tasmania is totally different from Victoria. And we can't ever get over the first hurdle of getting some kind of a national agreement on what this target should be. But there have been a huge number of European policies and measures that have been brought to bear in relatively recent times that relate to this. And they include having a trading scheme operational. We will have one in 2015 because the current carbon tax system or regime will move to a full trading scheme in 2015. And programs that involve improving situations in other countries and then compensating for your own emissions in that way. But many, for example, emissions from cars in 2009, Australia does not have a target for motor vehicle emissions. And yet, our current motor vehicle emissions per kilometre of CO2 are more than double the current European average. That is changing quickly because many people have gone to diesels and smaller cars, electric drive cars. All of those things are the good news about change taking place. But we don't have a standard that's driving this that's coming out of regulation. So there's a whole pile of issues down here that show, I think, some good news about actions within the EU. The World, the International Energy Agency, which I hope I won't upset anyone, to me is one of the more conservative international bodies that exist. In fact, it wasn't until relatively recently that I accepted that there was really an issue for energy and in the climate change issue. But this is what they said in 2011. That it's all about now securing energy supply for a reliable and supply of reliable and affordable energy, which they would have always said. But it's actually affecting a rapid transformation to a low carbon, efficient, environmental, benign system. And these are their words. What is needed is little short of an energy revolution. Now that has to be superimposed on what I'm sure you'll hear about, which is that there are a whole pile of other issues related to energy in Europe, related to security of supply, growth of demand, the issues about national ownership of resources and so on that need to be taken into consideration in the energy situation in Europe. So finally, let me talk just briefly about the human dimensions of some of this. There is a real world out there, and we all think we know what it is. And it's because we all try to interpret what that real world is. We have to do that in order to live it. We have to actually have some feel for what this world really is. And the community at large do this through what the behavioural science called constructivism. And this is ideas of the way the world is that is constructed from and heavily influenced by observation. Look around us, yeah, there are buildings there. But also very strongly affected by culture, by rules of our culture, of our religion, or of our governments, by our education, and by beliefs. and by myths. One of the myths that I tried to break right at the beginning was that somehow or other Mother Nature is so big and all-powerful, what we do is irrelevant. That's a myth, but it's very strong within the community, and it influences people to be able to say, well, we couldn't really do that, could we? But there are others, like the role of markets, human-created idea, but not perfect, the omnipotence of our individual gods is a myth because it can't all necessarily be right. The supremacy of individual races. These are myths that people have held on to and actually determine the way they see the world as a whole. There are many of them, and we all do it. This is not about you and me being different or more intelligent or better in interpreting these things. This is what we have to do to live. And we construct what really in a way is a non-reality world. On this side, we actually have within the community experts who know a little about, or a lot about a little. So I might know quite a lot about climate science, but I don't know very much about anything else. And I'm back here for most of the time. But we depend on this. This is actually what the Renaissance was about. It was about trying to actually use rationalism to look at the ideas of the way the world is based on formal observations, based on hypothesis testing, based on experimentation, and based on deduction. And most governments of the world, in fact many companies, will argue very strongly that they develop policy that is evidence-based. That's the terminology that's used. What they mean is that it's gone through this process, that it is really backed up by all of the kinds of arguments, observations, deductions that are reported here. And there are two problems with this. The first is that problems are not singly disciplinary problems. They involve a number of things. So many of us, as brought up and spent our life as scientists or others, have now realised that holistic rationalism is really required. We need multidisciplinary interpretations of the way the world is if they're going to be more realistic. They need to feed that through. Also, of course, there's a whole pile of filtering going on here by people who don't want necessarily the information to go down here because they're back here. They have vested interests, or they actually have so strongly held views about the way the real world is that they don't want any of this information to get through because it conflicts with their own views. And this is a statement by John F. Kennedy, which comes back to this issue of myths. And I think it's, I look at this and many of you will have different views about what John F. Kennedy was really about. But when I look at this quotation in isolation, I often think, well, I can't think of a member of the federal parliament in the 40 years that I've been thinking about these things that would write something like this. It actually suggests to me a fairly deep thought, and that is that it's not really about the lies. Are scientists telling lies about climate change? Are they doing it just simply to get more money for their research? These are the sorts of stories we get in newspapers every day. But it's about the myths, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And this is dangerous because it is unrealistic, doesn't really reflect the real world, but also because it gives you comfort. We all do it. It gives you comfort because you don't have to think about anything, and there's discomfort in some of these thoughts. I'll leave you with this one, which comes back to my overall diagram and says right at the beginning of it, it's really us. And that's our way of life. Thank you.
throw that slideshow back to the JFK quote. Much appreciated.
Questions? If you Google something like that line, it'll come up, I think, probably.
Quite a bit better.
Yes? Okay.
Well, this is just kind of a personal question because we have an orange farm on the Murray.
Yeah.
What is it looking like for wheat production up in, northern Victoria, southern New South Wales, and, the wine, grapes, the citrus industry?
Yeah. There's quite a lot being written about our anticipation of these regions. There was an organisation called the South East Australian Climate Initiative, which was funded by the state here and the federal government, and also the Murray-Darling Basin, to look specifically at the area you're looking at. And I think the story goes like this with uncertainties. Because the more regional, the more specific you try to get, the harder it is to be confident. Because you have to start to allow for the intervention of particular mountain ranges and topography that are not included in the major modelling. But the story is like this, that if you're in the southern part of that region, like in certainly southern Victoria, the likelihood is for decreasing rain ongoing. While the planet warms, this will happen. And we have now 100 years of record of the intensity of the high pressure system lying over the southern part of Australia, simply getting stronger with a 0.9 something correlation with global mean temperature. The study shows, however, that most of the loss is the winter rain, autumn and winter rain. And in fact, even through the last 2 years of high rainfall, it was still lower during that period than it had been historically. But the reason why I'm hesitating is that as you go north, we have quite strong evidence that as these systems move south, the tropical influence has increased. And so the northern part of the Murray-Darling looks pretty clearly that we're actually not getting a decrease in overall rainfall, but an increase in summer rainfall. So it depends on how far you are north of that. Sounds like where you are, you're probably in the middle. So there'd be quite a lot of uncertainty, I think, about making a projection as to whether it'll be up and down. It's interesting, you're in oranges, did you say? Yeah. Because most people feel that agriculture is the most sensitive section of our community to climate change. And it's not really true for most parts of agriculture because farming in general has a relatively short turnover. And so you have opportunities to change the cropping techniques, to change the actual crops, but not so much with oranges, almost overnight, and to adapt to changes taking place. And I think that for the wheat industry, for example, that's likely to be the case in Australia. So I personally don't see a huge threat to the wheat industry in Australia. There may be some shifts in area. There will be certainly probably some shifts in genotypes used as we go forward. But for citrus fruits, fruit trees, where you may have to wait for some years before you get a crop. For grapes, then you've got more of a threat because you're not quite sure what to do if you have to be planting 5 or 10 years ahead before you get fully productive crops. But that's the state of where we are at the moment. And if you go to the South East Australian Climate Initiative website, that program is finished now, with a lot of support, federal support, state support, finished for that research. But the website is maintained, and you'll be able to actually get directly to papers that refer to the area you're talking about. One more question. Yeah.
How does the European Union or the European countries, how do they come to an agreement with all these different countries, yet Australia as a relatively small, uniform nation can't come to any kind of concise agreement?
You probably need to ask the next speaker that one because he has some experience in this. I don't. I think probably it's because there is more diversity. It's bleeding obvious that we see Australia as being very homogeneous. It actually isn't that homogeneous. as I say, if you look at, take Tasmania as one example, virtually all of their electricity is generated from hydro, so it doesn't have an emissions associated with it, and very, very small. Compared with the Latrobe Valley or Victoria, where it all comes from brown coals, and from a carbon emissions point of view, it's the worst thing you can do. Hugely different. But then Victoria has a manufacturing industry that, by and large, Tasmania doesn't have. So we're not homogeneous, and I would argue that there was as much need for some debate around that issue. But in our federal system, it's almost impossible, particularly while we have party differences between the federal government and the states.
Yeah, mate, I've wanted to ask this for a long time, but I'm trying to pay off my house quickly, right?
Yes.
Or quicker. So what I do in winter is I chop firewood, right?
Yes.
And I don't cut down trees. There's just ground things there, but I try and take a little bit of guilt away, thinking that with the flutes, that they have this, you know, the way to filter it. But am I part of the problem? Like, with the wood that's going down, how that comes up and soaks up the carbon, and then I'm selling the wood off. Are us woodcutters being a pain, like we causing?
Well, it's interesting because I live in the suburb of Melbourne, and I can't get gas delivered to my house because it happens to be a fairly lowly populated suburb, and the companies won't put gas lines in. So I heat with wood. But I live on 5 acres. I actually generate enough wood falling off the limbs, and like one did the other day and crashed through the shed, destroyed it. So in my case, I actually feel reasonably comfortable that I'm cycling the carbon. That my own, but that's because I have 5 acres. If you're living on a small property, you're not doing that. So yeah, there are a couple of, in a way you are exacerbating the problem. One could argue that in any ecosystem, whether it be a forest ecosystem or desert ecosystem, the moment you take any energy out of that system or carbon out of the system, it's not going to be the same. Because before you came along, it was operating. All of that energy and that carbon flowed through the system. In the case of trees, something ate the trees, be it a fungus or an insect or whatever it was, and that was part of the totality of that ecosystem. But the reality, of course, is we exist as a species, and we use those systems all the time. And in fact, you can argue that that's exactly what agriculture is. It's taking away the diversity of a natural ecosystem and replacing it with a monoculture, so that we can actually get the energy and carbon that's stored concentrated for our own use, and not being used by all the other organisms that would have existed in a more complex ecosystem. So in principle, you're intervening with the system, and how much you'd have to think very carefully about that in those particular circumstances. Even if you actually take dead wood on the ground, that would have been part of the natural system before. There are other ways of looking at it, and that is that if you cut down the whole forest and use it to heat your house, then it would grow very rapidly back, and for a period of time it would actually be taking a lot of the carbon back out of the atmosphere. So it depends on where the final balance comes as to whether you've actually overcome the deficit that you created by taking it out.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.